Hello, and welcome back to the APUS History Curriculum for Era 8. In this video, we will be looking at Topic 8.8, which covers America's role in Vietnam. So let's get to it. After World War II, the U.S. and the Soviet Union emerged as rival superpowers, each seeking to expand its influence. Much as had happened in the Middle East and Africa, both sides sought to gain potential allies from the Third World, or the non-aligned countries. The U.S. feared the spread of communism, following a policy of containment, stopping communism from spreading to new nations, which dated back to the Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan. One key idea behind containment was the domino theory, the belief that if one country fell to communism, its neighbors would follow. This fear led the U.S. into conflicts around the world, including Korea in 1950, and most significantly, Vietnam. In 1954, the U.S. created the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, or SEATO, in order to counter communist expansion in that region. SEATO was meant to be an Asian version of NATO, but lacked significant military engagement and participation from Asian nations, with only Thailand and the Philippines joining. Major regional nations like India criticized SEATO, calling it a tool of Western imperialism. Unlike NATO in Europe, SEATO did not have a mutual defense clause obligating members to respond militarily if another member was attacked. Member nations often had differing opinions on what constituted a threat as well, and there was no unified military command, which further reduced its effectiveness. Despite its existence, it failed to stop the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, and SEATO never joined in on the Vietnam War. Vietnam ended up being part of the larger containment policy that the U.S. had been pursuing since the end of World War II. Ho Chi Minh had been a leader of the Viet Minh movement to resist Japanese occupation during World War II, and then later led efforts to resist the French attempt to reassert control over Indochina. At the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, the Vietnamese were able to score a decisive victory over the French, prompting them to give up their attempts to regain control of the region. After the Geneva Peace Conference in 1954, Ho Chi Minh established himself as the communist leader in the northern part of the country, while Ngo Dinh Diem would emerge as the leader in the southern part of Vietnam. Under the terms of the Geneva Accords, Vietnam was to be temporarily divided along the 17th parallel. Elections were supposed to be held to create a unified country, but with the north occupied by communists and the south occupied by those who opposed communism, those elections never happened. By 1960, the National Liberation Front, or NLF, had been established, the Americans called them the Viet Cong, in order to liberate the South from the Diem regime and unite the country. In addition to being a political entity, they also had their own fighters. Diem's regime opposed the NLF, and he used the South Vietnamese army against them, claiming the Viet Cong were forces supported by the North Vietnamese under Ho Chi Minh. This position was widely accepted by Western nations, who lent assistance to the Diem regime, as the United States did. Beginning in 1961, JFK sent special military advisors and Green Berets to train Vietnamese forces. Pentagon advisors told President Kennedy that at most 40,000 men would be needed to defeat the communists in Southeast Asia, which of course ended up being a severe underestimation. Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge warned JFK by the time you get to 1963 that America was going to lose Vietnam if Diem remained in power much longer. By late 1963, opposition to the Diem government had grown tremendously, and Buddhist monks even began protesting the harshness of his regime by setting themselves on fire in public suicides to focus the world's attention on their plight. In October of 63, both Diem and his vice president were assassinated. At this point, JFK seemed to have decided to withdraw American troops, believing that Vietnam would be an unwinnable war. although that plan wasn't going to be implemented until sometime after his return from a campaign trip to Dallas, Texas in November of 1963, which of course he never did. And since he'd never made his decision public, Lyndon Johnson could follow a different plan. Johnson believed that the Soviets were trying to take over all of the region and wanted to make sure that he wasn't the first president to lose a war, but he didn't have the votes in Congress for a formal declaration of war. Then in August of 1964, the USS Maddox, disguised as a fishing boat, came under fire in the Gulf of Tonkin. Congress responded with the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which allowed LBJ to use as many U.S. troops as needed for as long as necessary to protect American interests overseas. Essentially, it was a blank check for Johnson to conduct war. His policy called for a gradual escalation of U.S. troops in Vietnam. He also would authorize what was known as Operation Rolling Thunder, a 3-year massive bombing campaign using B-52 bomber aircraft, napalm, and Agent Orange to destroy the jungle canopy and expose potential routes bringing supplies to Viet Cong fighters. Then in early 1968, in what came to be known as the Tet Offensive, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops launched surprise attacks on nearly every provincial capital. Although it ended up being a military defeat for the communist forces, it was a political disaster for the United States because Johnson's government had been regularly reporting to the American people that the war was almost over, with the Americans on the verge of winning. The problem was that this is the first war to have the news media closely embedded with the soldiers on the front lines, and what they were reporting was vastly different from the official government press releases, leading to the development of a significant credibility gap. This shattered American confidence, led to massive anti-war protests, and forced Johnson to drop out of his campaign for re-election. The campaign for the presidency continued, of course, but the assassination of leading candidate Robert Kennedy and the chaos of the Democratic National Convention in Chicago that summer left the party weakened and opened the door for Richard Nixon and the Republican Party to win the presidency. Once Nixon took over, he focused on a plan of Vietnamization, or the gradual removal of U.S. troops, turning over the fighting to the South Vietnamese Army and only supplying funding for their operations. This strategy resulted in a reduction in protest at home, but at the same time, Nixon expanded the war beyond Vietnam by launching attacks on Cambodia and Laos, which border Vietnam. This in turn resulted in new protests. Nixon then began seeking peace with honor, as he called it, to completely withdraw U.S. troops from the region, although the heavy bombing campaigns continued. The Paris Peace Accords were signed in January of 1973 and called for a ceasefire, the withdrawal of all U.S. troops, the return of POWs, and the recognition of the 17th parallel as a temporary dividing line between the North and the South. While the U.S. withdrew, there was no requirement for any North Vietnamese troops in South Vietnam to withdraw as well. Plus, there were the Viet Cong fighters who were in South Vietnam and could continue the fighting against the South Vietnamese army anyway. This imbalance made it difficult for the South Vietnamese government to maintain control, leading to the eventual fall of Saigon in 1975. The final key concept associated with this topic focuses on Americans debating the appropriate power of the executive branch in conducting military and foreign policy. This debate was the result of the discontent that was growing in America. Over the course of the war, there were groups that vocally opposed government actions with regards to war. From the Beats in the 1950s to the hippies in the 1960s, these groups opposed the use of the military in favor of focusing on diplomacy. This became the definition of what it meant to be a liberal, while to be conservative was the exact opposite. This gave rise to the symbolism of the hawks and the doves as well, with the hawks supporting the war and the doves opposing it. With Lyndon Johnson effectively getting a blank check to wage war, when Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. The military could carry out various actions, even those that were deemed questionable. The blanket bombing of North Vietnam in Operation Rolling Thunder, and the use of chemical weapons like napalm and Agent Orange to destroy the forest canopy to reduce cover for enemy troops. But these harmed the civilian populations as well. Expansion of the bombing campaign into neighboring countries like Cambodia and Laos subjected even more civilians to significant harm, all of which results in increased protests. Revelations of atrocities committed by American troops, such as the My Lai massacre and the publication of secret government documents about the U.S. role in the war, the Pentagon Papers, revealed that the government had consistently been lying to the American public about the true nature of the war. These shifted public opinion even further against the war and led to increasing protests across the country, especially on college campuses, where students burned draft cards, marched, and staged sit-ins. Sometimes these protests were violently put down, like when the National Guard fired into a crowd of students at Kent State University in Ohio in an effort to disperse the protesters. 4 students were killed in that incident alone. Events like these led to a backlash against politicians who supported continued involvement, giving a chance for peace candidates to make gains. That's why LBJ had dropped out of the race in '68, because he was being challenged by peace candidates Eugene McCarthy and Robert Kennedy. As the war wound down, Congress also reacted by passing the War Powers Act in 1973, which limited how the president could use military forces. The act required the president to consult with Congress before committing U.S. forces to armed conflict and to report to Congress, only allowing troops to be in place for up to 60 days without congressional approval, although Congress can repeatedly extend the time without giving an actual declaration of war. Well, that about covers what you need to know about Topic 8.8 to the Vietnam War. Be sure to keep up with your reading, and I'll catch you in the next video.